We turn to someone on the inside who decided to speak out. And he is John Perkins, has written the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He came into our studios to talk about his former work going into various countries to try to strong-arm leaders into creating policy favorable to the U.S. government and corporations, what he called the corporatocracy. John Perkins says he was an economic hitman. I began by asking him to explain this term.
We economic hitmen during the last 30, 40 years have really created the world's first truly global empire. And we've done this primarily through economics, and the military only coming in as a last resort. Therefore, it's been done pretty much secretly. Most of the people in the United States have no idea that we've created this empire, and in fact throughout the world it's been done very quietly, unlike old empires where the army marched in. It was obvious. And so I think the significance of the things that you discussed, the fact that over 80% of the population of South America recently voted in an anti-U.S. president, and what's going on at the World Trade Organization, and also in fact with the transit strike here in New York, is that people are beginning to understand that the middle class and the lower classes around the world are being terribly, terribly exploited by what I call the corporatocracy, which really runs this empire.
Well, before we move further, your experience with it, explain the vantage point you come from. What does it mean to be an economic hitman?
Well, what we've done, we use many techniques, but probably the most common is that we'll go to a country that has resources that our corporations covet, like oil, and we'll arrange a huge loan to that country from an organization like the World Bank or one of its sisters, but almost all of the money goes to U.S. corporations, not to the country itself. Corporations like Bechtel and Halliburton, General Motors, General Electric, these types of organizations, and they build huge infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, highways, ports, industrial parks, things that serve the very rich and seldom even reach the poor. In fact, the poor suffer because the loans have to be repaid, and they're huge loans, and the repayment of them means that the poor won't get education, health, and other social services, and the country is left holding a huge debt by intention. We go back, we economic hitmen, to this country and say, look, you owe us a lot of money, you can't repay your debts, so give us a pound of flesh. Sell our oil companies your oil real cheap, or vote with us at the next UN vote, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world such as Iraq. And in that way, we've managed to build a world empire with very few people actually knowing that we've done this.
And you work for?
I was recruited by the National Security Agency, the one that's in the news so much today because of spying on people. And I was tested by them, recruited by them.
What do you mean you were recruited by them?
Well, while I was a senior in business school and at Boston University, they came to me and suggested that I take their tests. I had connections through my wife with people in the agency, and they put me through a series of tests, personality tests, lie detector, several days, and concluded that I would make a good economic hitman. And they also discovered a number of weaknesses in my character, which they could use then to hook me into the business. And then I ended up working for a private corporation.
Why didn't you work for the NSA?
Because these days it's not done that way. Nobody wants to be able to connect the dots. So the NSA, the CIA, these types of organizations often recruit economic hitmen, and the jackals, the assassins, the 007 types. But they will recruit us, maybe train us, and then turn us over to a private corporation so that you really can't make the connection. So that if I were caught at what I was doing in one of these countries, it would not reflect on our government. It would only reflect on the corporation that I worked for.
And who did you work for?
I worked for a company called Charles T. Main, a big consulting firm out of Boston.
And your job?
Well, I started off as economist, became chief economist, and my job, really, I had a staff of several dozen people. My job was to get them and for me to convince these countries to accept these very large loans, to get the banks to make the loans, to set up the deal so that the money went to big U.S. corporations. The country was left holding a huge debt, and then I would go in, or one of my people would go in and say, look, you owe us all this money, you can't pay your debts, give us that pound of flesh. The other thing we do, Amy, and what's going on right now in Latin America, is that as soon as one of these anti-American presidents is elected, such as Evo Morales, who you mentioned in Bolivia, one of us goes in and says, hey, congratulations, Mr. President. Now that you're president, I just want to tell you that I can make you very, very rich, you and your family. I've got several $100 million in this pocket if you play the game our way. If you decide not to, over in this pocket I've got a gun with a bullet with your name on it in case you decide to keep your campaign promises and throw us out.
Well, explain actually how that plays out, because it's not really in this pocket.
No, it's what I'm saying is that I can make sure that this man makes a great deal of money, he and his family, through contracts, through various quasi-legal means. And I can also, if he doesn't accept this, the same thing's going to happen to him that happened to Jaime Roldos in Ecuador, and Omar Torrijos in Panama, and Allende in Chile, and we tried to do it to Chavez in Venezuela, and are still trying, that we will send in the people to try to overthrow him, as in fact we recently did with the president of Ecuador. Or if we don't overthrow him, we will assassinate him. And these people all know the history. They know that this has happened many, many, many times in the past.
Explain what happened to Torrijos, for example, in Panama, and what did you have to do with it?
Well, this was back in the 70s, and Torrijos was making a lot of world headlines because he was demanding that the Panama Canal be turned back over to Panamanians. I was sent down to Panama to bring him around, to convince him that he needed to play the game our way. And he invited me to a little bungalow outside Panama City, and he said, look, I know the game, and I know if I play it your way, I'll become very rich. But that's not important to me. What is important is that I help my poor people. Now, Torrijos wasn't an angel, but he was very committed to his poor people. So he said, you can either play the game my way, or you can leave this country. And I talked to my bosses, and we all decided I should stay. Maybe I could bring him around. In the meantime, we could make some money. And so I stayed. But I knew the whole world was watching Torrijos because of this Panama Canal issue, and that if he didn't come around, the jackals would be likely to come in. He would set an example that others might follow. So I was very concerned. I like Torrijos, and one of the reasons I wanted to bring him around was not just because it was my job, but because I wanted to see him survive. And because he didn't come around, sure enough, he was assassinated.
How?
A fiery airplane crash, and afterwards there was no question that he'd been handed a tape recorder as he got on the plane that had a bomb in it.
How do you know this?
Well, I know the people that did the investigation afterwards, and this is pretty well documented in many places also, but I personally was aware of what went on. And of course, our official line here was that, of course, that wasn't what happened. The plane simply blew up and hit a mountain. But there was no question, and in fact, we were expecting this to happen. 3 months before this, another president, Jaime Roldos of Ecuador, who I also was involved in trying to bring around, he very strongly opposed our oil companies. Not opposed isn't the right word. What he said is oil from Ecuador has to serve the interests of the Ecuadorian people. Therefore, the oil companies are going to have to pay a lot greater share to the Ecuadorian people, or we're going to nationalize them. And he'd run on a very, very strong anti-American campaign. And we, knew that if he didn't change his ways, something would happen to him. We were in his office making the same promises. Here we've got a couple $100 million for you, or here we've got a bullet for you, basically. I mean, it's done a lot more subtly than that, but that's the short version. And 3 months before Torrijos, his airplane also exploded.
And what did the investigation reveal in that case?
Well, if you're talking about FBI investigations, it revealed that there was an airplane that exploded in both cases. If you're talking about local investigations and investigations that were done by many international journalists, there were explosives on those planes, both of them.